I'd like to introduce our second presenter this morning, Jennifer Baker. Jenny Baker is a Mirning woman from the Great Australian Bight on the on the southern coast. She was awarded her Doctor of Philosophy from the Faculty of Social Sciences at Flinders University in Adelaide, South Australia, for her thesis, Theorizing Survival, Indigenous Women, and Social and Emotional Well-Being. She has also been a registered nurse at the Adelaide Children's Hospital. She is currently the portfolio leader for teaching and learning and postgraduate program director at the David Unipong College of Indigenous Education and Research at the University of South Australia. Jenny now teaches in the School of Nursing at the University of South Australia and previously worked in the medical schools at both Flinders University and the University of Adelaide. Prior to her university work, Jenny was involved as a clinical manager at the Aboriginal Medical Services in Adelaide. So with that, I'd like to introduce Jennifer Baker.
Thank you very much, and I'm very honoured to be here. I was most surprised when I received the email. As I was saying, it was on a particularly bad day. I got this email asking me would I consider coming here, and so it has made my year, I have to say. So thank you very much, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this place and this beautiful country. And to the sponsors who of the Okanagan Nation Alliance and UBC Okanagan for their wonderful invitation to me. I've entitled my talk "Cultural Safety: The Ongoing Struggle to be Treated as Subjects, Not Objects," and it concerns the situation that we face in Australia right now. After 11 years of the John Howard government, it's been an awful, awful time. So I'm going to go through really, and I speak as a Mirning woman, as a grandmother, and as a nurse educator, and a health, someone who's also worked in the health sciences, and also as a former nurse. In my family, I'm regarded as the nurse. I will go and ask the nurse. So those of you who are nurses will understand what I mean. But I suppose just reflecting on that, I was sitting there and I was thinking, just to say that my mother, who's passed away now, but was born in 1911, in the area of the Great Australian Bight, and so there's a place there called the Nullarbor Plain. It's where it's the area where the whales come to give birth. So my mother was born on one side of the Nullarbor Plain, and my grandmother was born on the other side in the late 1880s or 1890s. Both of them were born in the traditional way by the traditional midwives. And so it was been, within my family, the journey for me is, to be born in Adelaide, to actually train as a nurse, to work in a university. It's a huge, it's a huge difference in actual what you do in your daily life. And when I took my mother back to where she was born in 1998, and she hadn't been back there for, I think, 40 years or something like that, and she's sitting in the back of the station wagon and she's saying, "We should not have started this journey so late. It's going to be dark when we get there." She said, and because she was remembering going down that same track in a horse and cart, and she just said, "Just turn back now, just turn back." And, so I said, "Look, Mum, I'll bet you $5 we'll get there before sundown." And but she won the bet. The sun just had gone down by the time we got in there, but it was still light. But I still remember that. It was just, and it's just her place where she was born and where she went to school is such it's actually an area renowned for white pointer sharks. They come there to give birth, and there's a huge one in the South Australian Museum from that place. So in terms of my mother and my grandmother, my father was non-Indigenous. He's passed away too. He was born not far from where my mother was born. So it's on my mother and father were born on Kukatha land, Kukatha Wirangu land, and my grandmother on Merning land. And my grandmother has come down, there were lots of really ancient trade routes across Australia where there was sharing of songs and artefacts and all sorts of things. But we are linked also back to the Kimberley, which is at the top of Western Australia. So my grandmother's people up from the top of Western Australia. So that's, there's lots of things for me to find out further. But yes, I thought I'd share that with you in relation to my own journey in the health sciences and as an educator and a nurse, and also in my teaching. So my talk is really about all the barriers to cultural safety that we face in Australia, and also, I guess, to outline the sorts of ideas that are there about Indigenous peoples that actually really get in the way of cultural safety, and that are still legacies of European thought that you would hope by this stage had been examined and these ideas sort of thrown away for the disgusting sort of ideas that they are. Okay, knowledge. I've used this quote to start because the principles for me, what principles do I start with when I talk about cultural safety? And this is from Edward Said, a Palestinian man who passed away a couple of years ago. And he says, and I guess I say this because I have to take in sort of some courage to go into places of European, the European Academy. So knowledge is most like itself when it undertakes to counter and oppose the unequal distribution of power in the world. Likewise, knowledge is least like itself when it becomes institutionalised and starts to collaborate with the interests of a dominant or ruling elite. So I guess in the academy, in the university, what we're trying to do is actually shift our students and shift those students who then go out to become nurses and doctors, to shift them to understand that they have a responsibility in relation to power and to actually the abuses of power. And I use this quote actually as a reminder of that. We are not a targeted population, we are the people of this land. And this is a quote from an Aboriginal poster in Australia. It really is to because there's an unconscious way that the health system moves along, has its own frameworks, its own jargon, and their idea sometimes the idea of equity is often divorced from history. It's divorced from understandings and feelings about the land. So this was on this poster, and I always think it's a really good line, a good quote to use. So the structure of my talk: old ideas and their legacies, thoughts on the historical context to the ideas that underlie dispossession and silencing, old and new examples, and I want to look at those in relation to professional practice and the implications for culturally safe practice. Old ideas and their legacies in actions and policies. This first example from Carl Jung, who I use this because in counselling, counsellors, well, in fact, at our university, they have just set up a new degree in counselling, which is Jungian counselling. So most people don't know Jung's position in relation to the so-called primitive. But here he says the child is born with a definite brain, and the brain of an English child will not work like that of an Australian blackfella, but in the way of a modern English person. And then he goes down the last line. Naturally, it carries with it, this English child's brain, naturally it carries it with it the traces of that history, exactly like the body. And if you grope down into the structure of the mind, you naturally find traces of the archaic mind. When counsellors, they may not study that in counselling, but for those ideas, for me, when a person comes up and says things like that, I say that those sorts of ideas permeate everything that they write about. I cannot sort of tolerate, I suppose, the fact that this hasn't been unpacked, and that that people are still not coming to grips with that. And just going back to Diane's talk about the idea of looking to our past and looking forward, that in terms of, I know one anthropologist writer that I read while I was doing my doctorate talked about how a lot of non-Indigenous people regard Indigenous people as their contemporary ancestors. It relates to that sort of idea, the contemporary ancestors, that even though you've actually gone through the same education system as them, that you're actually doing analysis in a high level, the same as them, that there's a belief and an idea that that they can give you advice. And I think that we struggle with that in Australia all the time. That, well, yes, you've got your idea, but and I want to go on a bit further about that. Thank you. I guess this is just another example to go with the Jungian one, which was this professor of the professor of physiology and anatomy at the University of Melbourne in 1928. And when I'm talking about this with students, I say, and that is when my mother was 17 years old. These are the ideas. Don't let us forget the ideas that circulated in our parents' and our grandparents' times, please, because we understand what they've gone through. So this was the Aboriginal boy sitting at school on desks without backs, directs only part of his attention to lessons, the rest is devoted to keeping himself erect. So in terms of, the Aboriginal people in Australia were seen as the missing link with the apes, those sorts of things. Okay, the next slide. And you can imagine that also that it took a long time for the University of Melbourne to actually admit people into medicine with attitudes like that. And as Nandi said, this is Ashis Nandi, an Indian man, who says that intellect and intelligence become IQ, the oral cultures become the cultures of the primitive or the pre-literate, the oppressed become the proletariat, social change becomes development. And so I want to talk about, as a result, the original domain vanishes from our awareness. This is particularly important in the health and caring professions, because we need to know what these ideas were built upon. Because for us as Indigenous scholars, we actually go back and actually find, well, where did this idea come from? Why would you need to do it like that? Why would you, and so, yes. So that's, I guess, in terms of unpacking things. Next slide. In terms of social change that becomes development, and again, it relates to the idea of looking forward or looking to our past. Enric Dussel from the University of Mexico traces the justification of colonial violence to a developmental fallacy. The fallacy rests on the view that Europe is the endpoint of a universal developmental process towards which all other peoples must and will go. I want to hold that there because, I want you to have that, just that, I guess, the abstract of that, because I apply that to the policies that certainly get in the way of providing culturally safe spaces for Aboriginal people. Dussel holds the view that it is not modern philosophical or scientific rationality that has been an instrument of terror, but a distinctly modern Eurocentric irrational myth that has resulted in the terror of what he calls sacrificial violence. And again, I want to explore what I think he means by sacrificial violence. Next. And this quote also, that Native Americans were not mistaken when they accused the whites of having forked tongues. By separating the relations of political power from the relations of scientific reasoning, the moderns have always had two irons in the fire. The way that I understand colonialism is that it provided the resources for the development of science, and without the plundering of people's lands, there would not have been the resources to undertake the scientific inquiries that happened in Europe. And then on top of that science was aided by the colonial policies, the politics, which and also science, obviously, the way that science created race, it actually started the hierarchy of races, which aided those people gathering those resources, whether it was the wealth that they set up their universities, whether it was the wealth that they set up enormous collections of artefacts, etc. But actually, and that science has developed in the world as the furnace of economic development. It actually has it has a logic that's very internal, that it is very hard to penetrate that and introduce issues around history and culture. So it has, I'm giving you my opinion. So if there's, physicists in the audience, fine. Basically, often I find there's a non-engagement with the land. There's a non-engagement with love and with really important things that make up our living days. And in terms of actually how those scientific ideas then translate into that economic development, this is a quote from Roger Solomon, the late Roger Solomon, Injibati man from the west coast of Western Australia. And he says in this film, which is a wonderful film if you can get a chance to get it, it's called Exile and the Kingdom. It's made by the Injibati people around Roebourne, and it actually documents, it took them 5 years to make, and it won a Human Rights Award in Australia. It documents, the community told the filmmakers how they wanted their story to be told, and it documents, it's a wonderful film. But anyway, he says in this that what we saw in the mining boom in the Pilbara in the 1990s, now as you know, Australia rides on this mining resource boom. And in fact, the latest interventions into Aboriginal communities, Aboriginal leaders believe are related to access to those resources. He says it was like a repeat of the nightmare our ancestors went through 100 years ago during the pearling boom. The biggest difference is that during the first boom, our people were slaves on the pearling boats, while during the second, we were left right out of the workforce in terms of actually so how, and I keep bringing it back to how do I teach cultural safety to nurses who would go there? I would teach this history. Nurses have to come face to face with what has happened here, and it's often can't be explained. They have to just take it on board and actually listen to what the people are saying. Next. And to remind the students that I teach that prior to colonisation, this is a quote from the National Aboriginal Health Strategy of 1989. I was very privileged to be involved in the development of that strategy. Prior to colonisation, Aboriginal people had control over all aspects of their life. They were able to exercise self-determination in its purest form. They were able to determine their very being, the nature of which ensured their psychological fulfilment and incorporated the cultural, social and spiritual sense. So going back to Dussel and the sacrificial violence, I thought that and this idea of economic development and economic progress, that Kleinman talks about the forms that violence can take. Arthur Kleinman, who's a Jewish a sociologist, anthropologist and physician. He says, sometimes this violence is sudden, at other times it takes the form of a continuous reign of terror. Even when violence is not present in such dramatic forms, there can be the slow erosion of community through the soft knife of policies that severely disrupt the life worlds of people. That's certainly, following the colonial frontier that passed through Australia in some places only 150 years ago. But certainly since that time, the policies that have basically severely disrupted our life worlds. We were left out of the 1901 Constitution, and those constitutional rights were not bestowed until 1967.